The world is holding its breath as a new chapter unfolds in the tense U.S.-China relationship. The shadow of a trade war looms as the United States prepares to impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles, starting in 2025. These measures, enacted in the first week of April, have sent seismic waves around the globe and forced America's closest allies, such as the European Union and Canada, to reconsider their strategic alliances. As the U.S. administration tightens restrictions, China is luring with tempting manufacturing and energy deals. Many experts are wondering if it's time for the EU and Canada to turn their eyes to the vast Chinese market. The question of a possible shift of trillions of dollars in trade flows from the U.S. to China by Europe and Canada is becoming increasingly relevant. President Trump's claims that everything will be just fine are not reassuring markets, especially amid the introduction of global tariffs and the growing demand for Chinese goods. Trade between the European Union and the United States reaches an impressive $700 billion, while Canada and the U.S. exchange goods and services worth $300 billion. Starting in January 2025, the Trump administration has consistently introduced tariffs against China, citing the need to protect national interests. The latest package, announced on April 2nd, affects key industries such as electronics, steel, aluminum, chemicals, and high-tech components. China, in turn, promises to take retaliatory measures, creating uncertainty for American exporters. Europe and Canada have long expressed concern about U.S. protectionist policies, considering them harmful to global trade. In this regard, the question of closer cooperation with China is increasingly being raised, which could lead to a redistribution of trade flows and a change in the global economic landscape. Public opinion in the countries of the European Union and Canada demonstrates a noticeable evolution in relation to the United States. Sociological studies show that a significant majority of citizens, from 55 to 60%, expressed disapproval of the Trump administration's trade policy, seeing in it signs of economic protectionism that has a stifling effect on entrepreneurial activity. British media actively covers the results of surveys conducted in social networks, where European voters increasingly express the view that the tariff measures initiated by Washington harm national exporters and lead to higher prices for consumer goods. A similar picture is observed in Canada, where hopes for improved relations with the arrival of the Biden administration have been replaced by disappointment due to the resumption of tough tariff policies. Ottawa is forced to look for alternative options, fearing that the U.S. may arbitrarily change the terms of trade agreements. This public reaction creates fertile ground for discussions about reorientation towards China. Beijing, in turn, demonstrates its willingness to further open its market to European and Canadian companies. Priority tasks for China include concluding agreements with Canada on the supply of energy resources, such as oil and liquefied natural gas, as well as participating in joint research programs with Europe in the field of high technologies. Economic observers draw attention to the impressive trade turnover between China and Europe, estimated at $800 billion, which has every chance to increase with the connection of Canada. It's not just about expanding commodity flows, but also about deepening financial interaction. In Canadian business circles, the possibility of reorienting exports of oil and liquefied natural gas from the American to the Chinese market is being seriously discussed. Industry representatives in social networks lament that U.S. tariff policy makes trade with this country unattractive, while China demonstrates huge demand for energy resources. Similar sentiments are observed among European automakers. They see the Chinese market as an opportunity to compensate for losses incurred due to American tariffs. German and French companies, which already have strong positions in China, are considering expanding their presence as a promising strategy. To understand the scale of the changes taking place, it is worth referring to the figures. In 2024, trade between the European Union and the United States came close to the $1 trillion mark, amounting to $995 billion. At the same time, American exports reached $450 billion, and exports from the EU to the U.S., $545 billion. The trade turnover between Canada and the United States amounted to $42 billion. These colossal volumes testify to the close economic relationship between the two sides of the Atlantic. By the mid-decade, as Donald Trump was vociferously criticizing China and threatening Europe and Canada with secondary tariff sanctions, political circles in Europe and Canada began to question whether it was time to reassess their strategies. Public sentiment increasingly suggested that instead of facing such high risks, it might be worth considering cooperation with China, which offered more affordable production and a broader sales market. Of course, this didn't necessarily mean completely abandoning partnerships with the United States. Rather, it was about shifting focus, reallocating priorities in favor of China, and diversifying economic ties. Canada, whose economy heavily relies on exporting oil, liquefied natural gas, and electricity to the U.S., felt this necessity particularly acutely. In 2024, Canada's oil and gas revenues, amounting to approximately $100 billion, were primarily driven by the American market. However, if tariffs or other sanctions from the U.S. hindered these exports, Canada might have to consider large-scale projects with alternative buyers such as China, the European Union, or even Japan. It's worth noting that such a transition would require significant investments in the construction of new pipelines and liquefied natural gas plants, undoubtedly a costly undertaking. Canadian public opinion is increasingly leaning towards supporting pipeline projects oriented towards global markets, rather than solely the United States. Surveys indicate that up to 60% of Canadians express a willingness to diversify trade flows, tired of the protectionist policies of the Trump administration. Ottawa, in turn, can count on voter support by emphasizing that such diversification would strengthen the country's strategic independence. In response to American objections, pointing to the already significant volume of trade between the two countries, there is growing discontent in Canada regarding the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. A similar picture is emerging in the European Union. Germany, in particular, heavily depends on the American market for its automobile exports. In the event of further tariff increases on European cars, German manufacturers might refocus on China, where their products are already in demand. Southern European countries, such as Italy, France, and Spain, also expressed dissatisfaction with U.S. protectionist measures on agricultural and food products. European officials are increasingly stating their unwillingness to ignore the vast Chinese market, especially given the trade instability created by Trump's policies. Behind the scenes of European politics, according to leaked information, a scenario is brewing that could alter the geoeconomic landscape. The European Commission may be revising its long-term trade forecasts, predicting a decline in the U.S. share and a strengthening of Asia's position. Closer ties with China certainly raise critical issues such as intellectual property protection and human rights. However, the age-old question of prioritizing economic benefit finds different answers in Europe. Amid criticism of China from the Trump administration, voices are growing louder about the possible increase in tariffs on Chinese goods. The proposed range is from 34% to 50%, which, combined with existing duties of 20% or 10%, could lead to an unprecedented level of 104%. In China, such measures are seen as an economic blockade. In this situation, the European Union and Canada express concerns that such a tightening of trade policy could trigger a global recession. Against this backdrop, British media reports that the EU and Canada are increasingly discussing the idea of reorienting towards cooperation with China in their own interests. It appears that this trend is moving from the stage of theoretical discussions to the realm of real state policy. The focus of global economic discussions has firmly settled on the agro-industrial complex, mining and processing of minerals, production of rare metals, automobile manufacturing, the oil and gas industry, and liquefied natural gas. The issue of China's dominance in the rare earth elements market is of particular importance. Experts note that deepening cooperation between the European Union, Canada, and China in this strategically important area could undermine the technological leadership of the United States, making them dependent on external suppliers. The attractiveness of a partnership with China for the EU and Canada is driven by the scale of their markets and resource potential. The European Union, with its 450 million inhabitants, represents a huge consumer market. Canada, despite its relatively small population, possesses vast reserves of energy and natural resources, acting as an alternative supplier to the United States. The formation of an EU-Canada-China trade and economic triangle is raising concerns in the United States, which fears being isolated from key global processes. Experts in social media are actively discussing potential steps Washington might take to prevent such a scenario. It is possible that the Trump administration will try to persuade the EU and Canada by offering them new, more favorable trade agreements. However, against the backdrop of the ongoing tariff war and protectionist rhetoric, European and Canadian partners may conclude that further cooperation with an unstable administration is not advisable, opting instead for more predictable and mutually beneficial alliances. However, can such a redistribution of power occur in a short time frame? Analysts agree that an immediate break in economic ties is not realistic. Trade between the European Union and the United States reaches an impressive $995 billion, while trade between Canada and the United States is around $400 billion. Redirecting these colossal flows to China overnight is a difficult task from both a technical and political point of view. At the same time, there is a view that even a gradual shift, for example, of 5% per year, could lead to a significant redistribution of financial resources. If European companies start creating new production facilities in China, and Canada focuses on building pipelines and liquefied natural gas, LNG, plants oriented towards the Asian market, an economic structure less dependent on the United States could form within 5 to 10 years. Social media commentators suggest that if the U.S. administration underestimates the importance of Europe and Canada, the United States risks permanently losing part of its share of the global market in the long term. Despite this, given the high level of domestic consumption and the strong innovative potential of the United States, complete exclusion from world trade seems an unlikely scenario. However, experts warn that even a 10 to 15% reduction in trade could cost the American economy billions of dollars. Public opinion plays a decisive role in shaping the foreign policy of states. Sociological studies conducted in Canada reveal an interesting dynamic. A significant proportion of Canadians, around 40 to 45%, express doubts about the reliability of the United States as a partner, preferring to develop relations with China. At the same time, about 70% of respondents admit that a complete rejection of cooperation with the United States is impossible at this stage, but emphasize the need for diversification and exploration of alternative options. Similar sentiments are evident in European countries. Donald Trump's trade policy, in particular the introduction of tariffs of 34% and 50%, has drawn criticism in France and Germany, where more and more people are leaning towards the idea of excessive dependence on the American market. There is growing concern about the possible consequences if similar protectionist measures are applied to them. Socioeconomic instability only exacerbates these concerns. Representatives of various industries, including farmers, manufacturers, and importers, are increasingly declaring their willingness to reorient themselves towards the Chinese market, which seems to them more predictable and stable. They see China as an opportunity to implement long-term projects, in contrast to the uncertainty associated with American policy. This trend could lead to a weakening of the U.S. position in the international arena and a loss of allies. China, in turn, has significant production potential and broad trading opportunities. It can offer European and Canadian partners competitive alternatives in the energy sector, including oil and liquefied natural gas, LNG. In addition, Beijing is ready to provide long-term guarantees for the purchase of Canadian products, which creates the impression of a more reliable and predictable partner compared to the volatile policies of the Trump administration. In the face of instability brought about by American policy, China appears as a guarantor of long-term stability in trade and economic relations. Undoubtedly, human rights issues and differences in political courses cause some criticism from the European Union and Canada. However, if economic considerations prevail, these differences may be pushed into the background in order to ensure stability in trade. Analysts predict that China may take advantage of the situation to conclude major strategic agreements with the EU and Canada, which, in their opinion, are tired of the tension in trade relations with the United States. Paradoxically, all these events have become a peculiar echo of the Trump administration's policy aimed at containing China through the introduction of additional tariffs. While the U.S. sought to isolate China, the EU and Canada are increasingly leaning towards the idea of cooperation with it for their own benefit. In social networks, this phenomenon has been dubbed the boomerang effect, and some even argue that Trump is panicking as Washington risks losing the support of its closest allies due to disagreements with China. Ultimately, even if the EU and Canada do not significantly reduce their total trade with the U.S., estimated at $1 trillion, redirecting a portion of these funds to China will lead to a significant influx of capital into the Chinese economy. Global trade is on the verge of epoch-making changes that could redraw the world's economic map and form new centers of influence in energy and high technology. The crucial question is, will the European Union and Canada be able to show foresight by betting on cooperation with China instead of the traditional orientation towards the United States? This step is certainly fraught with considerable logistical and political risks, but may prove justified in the long term. If Washington does not abandon the protectionist policies inherited from the Trump administration, the world is steadily moving towards the formation of several powerful economic blocs opposing each other. Heated discussions are unfolding on social media. Some predict an imminent recession, while others, on the contrary, see new opportunities for universal prosperity and trade diversification. In the coming months, we will witness decisive events when the EU and Canada are likely to take concrete steps to reorient their trade flows. The consequences of these decisions for the global economy cannot be overstated.